Good day. Welcome to session number 14 for the module History and Theory of Architecture. So today we're going to talk about postmodernism as well as some concluding thoughts. So for the contents in this sharing, we'll be discussing following through from what we spoke about in the last sharing on modernisms. So late modernisms, bringing us into postmodern, and philosophically, what does postmodernism encompass? And the fourth segment, we're talking about postmodernisms because, as you will understand later on, actually there are multiple viewpoints, which is one of the key philosophies of postmodernism, right? Which rightfully and logically, it will branch off into many versions of postmodernisms. Okay, so amongst which there's deconstruction, deconstructivism, and there's a postmodernisms, right? So it might sound a bit fluffy right at the moment, but it's very interesting if you look into it, the details and into the workings of the philosophy behind what they are doing and the ideology behind. So the image that you see on the right, the walking city in New York, by Archigram. This is in 1964, right? So you can see it's a collage. It's a kind of juxtaposition of projection of the future, of architecture in the future, urban planning in the future, right? Against the backdrop of the existing New York cityscape. Okay, so this is quite interesting because once again the possibility is made. The possibility of this kind of this mode of visual presentation and storytelling is made possible by the technology of the day, right? So at every point in time in history, right, as I think you should have realized now, that we are trying to make the most, trying to make the best out of the opportunities and the technologies, the materials we have at our disposal. And at the same time, depending on your position, we take varying reference to the existing, and depending on the individual once again, right, we go to different depths, right, in terms of history and tradition, right. But by now, I hope that the class has a better appreciation about the value of history. Okay, so carrying on from the last sharing, for late modernism, after World War II, remember that consumerism was a driving force, right, behind the economy. So while the US was driven by consumerism and design was supported a good life, right, the projected ideal kind of lifestyle, right? Britain and other countries had serious social needs, right, and experienced a time of political change, right? So it's quite, if you look at the history, right, in the aftermath of World War II, actually within Britain and Europe itself, the continent had more physical changes, right, because there was the physical war was being fought in Europe, right? But whereas in US, they are more detached, right? So there's less rebuilding, physical rebuilding to be done. Okay, that's why which brings us to the point here about the different directions or the different needs between the US and in Europe. Right, so for simplicity, we'll just refer to, say, Britain. Right, so the post-World War II population boom meant that there were new towns in Britain, driven by economically and hygienically housing needs and consideration. Right, so it's not about fancy things like how beautiful, how nice the building looks, but more about how do you house these people and take care of the basic hygiene. Right, how house them and how do we build in a very economic manner and how do we build fast? Okay, so not only Le Corbusier's international modernism was called into motion, right? But there was a rough cast concrete version of modernism called brutalism, right? So if you look closer into deeper into brutalism and what it stands for, beyond the superficial, right, that usually will be used to when we talk about the term brutalism, right? You have certain expectations of the facade treatment and material treatment, right? But deeper down, actually, there's a reason for that, right? It's because of economy. There's limited resources, right? So they have to build and house so many people, and they have to build it fast, right? And therefore, it all kind of leads to this brutalist movement, right? So it's not as philosophical; it's actually quite a practical result of the circumstances, right? So on the right, you can see this is a SIT brochure in 1953. Okay, so in today's context, I think you can recollect at the SIT flats, right, around Tiong Bahru area. So some of them are conserved, right, whereas others are the other flats that are across the road are actually not under conservation status, right? But actually, rightfully, they should be, right? But at the moment, for city planning, in terms of planning, they are not at the moment, right? So they are remnants of the past, right? This period of time, right? So we need to preserve, we need to conserve them as part of the heritage of our nation building. Okay, so brutalism was led by socialist ideas of housing the masses using modern construction methods and material. Okay, so SIT started and later it became HDB. Okay, so there was a reference, right, from the British brutalism, right? It's not from, they're building from scratch, right? But on an ideological level, they're taking reference to something, right? After all, when something has been done, we have the benefit of hindsight, right? You can study what worked and what did not work, and you can consider because the climate is different, right? So in terms of climate, do we need to do any adaptation? The answer is yes, lah. Right. So what kind of adaptation do we need to do in order for this kind of mass housing, high density housing, to suit our tropical climate? Okay. So similarly, our flats were driven by social ideals of economy and hygiene for the masses. Okay, so it's not perfect, right? But back then, it was the best that we could do with the amount of resources and the technology we have at our disposal. Okay, so this is image of the Toa Payoh New Town, right? Back then in 1968. So very new at that point in time. But nowadays, when you think about it, right, you probably have this idea that, Toa Payoh area, this location, these are the really old flats. Yeah. So, but once upon a time, it was like the experiment, the model, the test bed model, something really new. Okay, so in the 50s and 60s, right, high-rise buildings in Singapore were also built of raw concrete and exposed brick. Okay, so it's which contributed to a very unique facade treatment, right, in my opinion, and there's a certain quality to it, not really brutalist, not exactly brutalist, but there's a very nice texture and aesthetics to it. So SID and HDB, they looked at slab blocks, communal corridors, and amenities of the British new towns to create the first new town in Singapore, which is Toa Payoh. Okay, so this is very different. You might imagine that at this point in time, okay, this is Toa Payoh 1967 photograph. So it's like tabula rasa, right? And these slabs were built. It's almost like a model, right? Like an urban planning model, almost like Le Corbusier's urban planning model that we have seen, right, in the previous lectures. So at this point in time, right, like most of the population, they're living in villages, like these atap houses, single-story houses. They're living in maybe the shop houses nearer to Singapore River, right? So depending on what kind of industries you're working in, right? But things were pretty low rise. Okay, so this was a kind of quite a bold move lah, right? With a certain vision that they were that they were chasing. Okay, so the idea thing, the vision, right, is actually very important, right? So as architects and planners, usually we'll be thinking at least, I would say, at least 25 years ahead, right? 50 years ahead, right? So that's the blueprint, right? Because if you don't have a vision, you have nothing to work towards, right? So the new towns had all the amenities and conveniences of modern life that we are used to, right? Things like shops, parks, schools, and transportations. Right? So they are self-sufficient and self-contained, right? So this is still the underlying idea or the goal that we have for HDB planning, right? In fact, now we are looking at self-contained precinct. Okay, so I mean, it's arguable what works and what doesn't work, right? So, but at any point in time, right, we make the best out of it. So I think in 1967, well, almost 60 years ago, right? So now if you look at Toa Payoh, you can see the results of it. So it's very complex. It's a mature town, complex, self-sustaining, self-containing, right? That you can have, you can live very well, right? If you just stay within that town itself, right? You actually need not travel outside, all right? So apart for maybe work, right? So that's another thing altogether lah. But the thinking about the program, the requirements for work, right, is a consideration within the town at the point in time. That's why there is always a back then one of the economical activities is manufacturing, right? So it's not like all white collar jobs, right? There are blue collar jobs as well. So there's always a mix of the industry with this high density housing, right? Which is very interesting. Like if you look at the changes in the master plan through the ages. Okay, so brutalism was called brutalism because of the unfinished, unrefined, exposed concrete surfaces. Okay. So brick, concrete, because they are left plain for all to see, right, is considered, it's kind of linked to the brutalist movement, right? While the interior was raw concrete and cinder block, which is kind of concrete blocks. Okay, so the aim was to provide a blank space to create a new and modern life in, and the interior was thus left to the occupants to furnish and complete with the comforts of modern life. So it's kind of like a win-win situation, like the image you see on the right? Queen Elizabeth II visiting Toa Payoh in 1972, right? So imagine if you give everything, right, you are actually excluding a lot of opportunities. Things like furnishing, things like renovation, things like furniture, so on and so forth. Right, these are industries, right, that can lead to employment opportunities, right? So it can feed a whole load of people, right, with these kind of industries, right? That's why it's kind of a win-win situation, right? Because if you don't provide the finishing, you are not spending that extra bit of money, while you're allowing the potential for new industries to emerge, right, which will contribute to employment in Singapore. So brutalist architects were different to early modernism, right, as in where consumer technology and consumerism were valued. So images you see, the colorful images that you see on the right, Plug-in City by Archigram, 1964, are a projection of what the city of the future will look like. Okay, so you can contrast these images with what you've seen in the previous few slides, right? One is about the practicalities, and one is about the vision, envisioning the future. So both can occur concurrently at the same time, right? Usually by different groups of people, right, with different interests, right? But as a population, right, we come together and we agree to disagree, and the benefit is that now you have both projections and the practical coexisting at the same time. So housing the poor was important, right? But it would be glamorous, pop culture, commercial modernisms, and social values all mixed together. So on the other hand, because of the need to project and to visualize and to dream and to imagine, Archigram and the Smithsons use pop culture collage to create exciting and surreal architectural visions of the future. All right, so it probably won't work, right? And there will be many people saying that, oh, this is a waste of resources, right? Doing all these kind of projections, which are just pure fantasy. But these are very important because sometimes you need to, as mentioned and just now, right? We need a vision, right, to project and to chase, right? If not, there will be no innovation, there will be no progress. Okay, so how it translates to Singapore, right? You can see, okay, Archigram, the architectural elements, there is a frame, there are modular units, there are components that you can plug in and plug out, right? So these are machine aesthetics and opportunities made possible by machines, right? So they're using that as a reference to generate these kind of ideas. Okay, so like the image that you see at the bottom, right? Even the housing unit itself becomes like really small, self-contained, as though in a pod, right? It's like a pod, self-sustaining pod. So the concept of living in a city becomes very different, right? If you trace back, remember we did like the Malay house, right? And we were talking about the community functioning as a whole, right? So we still have that, but now the unit itself becomes like a pod, and the meeting places is no longer like some open space, it might be, I don't know, a bigger pod, so on and so forth. Okay, so in the 1970s, right, actually to me it's a very exciting time. Okay, so the image I see on the right, okay, very familiar, right? It's Golden Mile Complex, right? So this is by DP, 1973. So this is very amongst the few, in my opinion, the treasures, right, in our urban landscape. So early works by William Lim and Design Partnership, right? Nowadays we know it as DP. Merge brutalism, pop culture, and social ideas, create a new vision for modern Singapore. So this is Golden Mile Complex. We also have the People's Park Complex. These are experiments, right, with a new kind of typology, thinking about how do we live in a very high density kind of urban context, right? So it translates into architectural spaces like large public atriums, interiors, sheltered streets, right, which is borrowing the idea of the 5-foot way in the shop houses, right? So these projects were to be interconnected via linked bridges, right, elevated, and then the road is on one level and the bridges are on the other. Okay, so this like Golden Mile itself, right, is like a self-contained unit, right, and then it's plugged and linked via a bridge to the adjacent lot. Okay, so that's kind of like the concept, and it's like although it's a building itself, right, but if you check out the circulation within Golden Mile itself, it's supposed to be a whole street, right? So it's imagine like now, previously it was like maybe 10 times the land that you require, right? Now you divide it into okay, this is just for visualization. So you cut up the land, right? So 10 parts to it, and then you slot it, overlay into one another, right? And you link it up by escalators, staircases, lifts, and so on and so forth to create that kind of experience. So these projects give Singapore the shopping mall typology that we are used to nowadays, and it's like replicated everywhere. Right? Things like the podium block, suburban, urban consumerist interior space of the shopping atrium. Right now we are so familiar with it, you know. So, but once upon a time, it was almost like an avant-garde kind of experiment, right? And back then, luckily we had the adventurous spirit, right, to go and test it out, right? Luckily, yeah. So like in this typology, it's actually very interesting how the concept of a plug-in city is adapted to Singapore. For example, the atrium space, right? If you think about Golden Mile Complex, the atrium space is at a podium, right? The bottom, the around the three stories from ground level, from the road level, right? And then there's the kind of basement car park, right? So you had the podium retail space, and the residential space is actually the slanted block. Okay, so it's very interesting because how, if you think about self-sustaining, right? So people need to work, live, play. Okay, so to live, they need apartments. To work, they can work in offices. They can also work in the shops, right? So play, you need common, larger volume spaces where people can gather, right? So it's all worked into one. So how then do you circulate them around? For example, if let's say from office hours, right, from say between 9 to 6, most of the people will actually not be at home, right? They'll be working. So in this typology, right, you see that the apartments are slept. It becomes like a part of a roof or a shading kind of structure. So when the noon sun is up, right, it enters the balcony, right? So if you like to plant, if you are into greenery, or you can even do sun tanning and stuff like that, is the idea of a very healthy and holistic living, right? And at the same time, it functions as like almost like a part of a roof slab, right? Because majority of the people will be working in an office block, right, which is shaded by this slanted line, and in the shopping atrium kind of podium space, right? So it's only when the sun sets, after evening, in the evening, actually, they will be having their dinner at the first level, you know, the F&B spaces, right? Then maybe doing a bit of shopping. So as the sun sets, you know, the building mass cools, right? That is when people go back to their apartments, right, and enjoy their apartments, the apartment spaces, right? So it does consider that movement of the user of the space between daytime and nighttime. Okay, so this is part more of the considerations that they have. So the continuous search for novelty in consumer culture and translate into design, and focus on faster, better, and cheaper, right? These were the first critics of modernisms, right? So postmodern, if you are trying to define it in the most simplified version, right, is a critique of modernism, right? So modernism has its limitations, right? And then now we are responding to it, and so there's a postmodernism movement coming up. Okay, so there's a response to modernism. Without modernity, there will be no need for postmodernism. Okay, so in the critique is the search for simplicity, for speed, for efficiency, right? So one of the critique in this writing by Henry Lafebvre was that the new ways of designing the new towns based on modernist principles, right, fragments the people and mediates their interaction by limiting the possible interaction and predetermining the way that we are supposed to live our lives, right? So it's like cookie cutter. It's like very mass produced. Okay, so like the typology of the school, right, back then is kind of modeled after the factories, Yeah, which is a very disturbing thought, like if you think about it. So the factories and the schools actually they have the same kind of building typology. Okay, so architecture can affect the entire way that we perceive our life. Okay, so don't belittle the potentials. So the problem of the new town, right, is that its planning reduces everything to function, to logic, to legibility, right? So things like surprise, things like wonder, they are removed from the thinking altogether. So image on the right, you see unit de habitation, this famous building by Le Corbusier. It's like the precursor to the HDBs and even brutalism that we are used to. But you notice that for him, right, it's not as such. He did consider those kind of large open spaces, filled with sunlight, fresh air, wonderful circulation, and these large open spaces for the kids to grow up healthily in, to play and dream, to imagine. Okay, but these were removed, right? These aspects were kind of removed, and then they were only looking at they're looking at this model, the unity habitation, and they're only looking at the function. They're looking at only at the efficiency, only looking at materials, so on and so forth. But they are missing out all these wonderful things that Le Corbusier has included in his design. So there was no pleasure, there was no interpretation, right? Everybody is supposed to group think, like we're supposed to think in this one way, right? We are not recognizing that everybody is unique, right? They can think differently, right? Hence, it becomes a wasteland, right? Yes, you can build very fast. Yes, you can progress, right? But you are actually not maximizing the potentials and the diversity of the human being, or the human civilization. So the radiant city is actually, in its application, in the real world application, is considered dull. Okay, so this critique of modernity is the beginning of postmodern thought. So from the 1916 onwards, right, various thinkers critique modernist beliefs and morals. Okay, so once again, if you link it back to the previous slides, right, so we came from like thousands of years ago. You notice that it's always like establishing something, right, and then something goes into full-fledged, full momentum, right, and then the other opposing view comes into play, right, or the philosophy breaks up on its own, and then there's a new coming up. So it's always it's a dual function in a very simplistic way. So breaking up, reforming, or forming, critique, and reforming, challenging, right? So that's the consistent rhythm throughout civilization, how they develop. So the postmodernists found many modernisms, right? There's enormous variety, and visual language is not homogeneous, right? Everybody should express themselves rather than subscribing to a set of rules in a very narrowly defined style that it had become. Okay, so actually the start of modernism is very beautiful, right? But the application, right, kind of dulls along the way, right? Of course, if as you can see, like in the previous slide, right, the vision and what Le Corbusier actually built and dreamed into that the architectural model, right? But not all of it was implemented on a larger scale, right, which contributed to the issues. So modernism had been about progress, a belief in a better future, in the power of man, the will of science, and the ability to create the best possible outcome for all. All right. So the drive to create the best is, I think, is a kind of inherent desire or the driving force in us. Okay. So even postmodernism itself was driven by this search for the best possible outcome. Okay, so modernism was supposed to be the end of history and to be the universal single solution, which is appropriate for everyone, everything, and everywhere. So postmodernism questions these kind of assumptions and the idea of a grand narrative, a grand singular narrative, right? So this is a possible scenario. Okay, so under modernism, right? So when they look at this unit habitation, they will say that, okay, this is a dream, this is a solution. So I will times 100 times, then maybe I'll take care of this town. Then I'll times 1,000 times, then maybe I'll take care of the city. Then I'll times like 10,000 times, then I'll take care of the country. That's the kind of sequence of thought, right? So, but when it comes to postmodernism, right, they recognize that, okay, this is one possible solution, right? It cannot be the universal one. So this is one possible solution. We need to see what works, what doesn't work, and then on the other hand, we're gonna throw in what new thoughts we have, new ways of looking at the world, new questions that arise, right? And we question and we challenge and we put things together, and it becomes a new kind of experiment, a new model. Okay, so Charles Jenks dates the end of modernism to the demolition of the Pruitt Eagle in 1972, right? Where is one of the modernists is seen as the physical demonstration of the failure of the modernist ideal, right? So the demolition itself, as captured in photograph, is quite iconic, right? Because it's like a physical destruction, captured as a kind of like a moment in pop culture. So the lack of variety, lack of everything, distinction, nuances, visual language, diversity, all right, due to this regarding history, all right, end of the day, it turns its back onto itself and destroyed it. So by the 1960s onwards, right, modernisms had become just a style, right, and it has lost its substance. Okay, so this kind of tendency is also quite consistent throughout history, right? If you think about the movements or the periods in history that we have covered so far. So this one you can read, on time, but if you're gonna pick out the important words, right? The one word that I personally find relevant, or rather it summarizes the approach, is the word of destabilizations. All right, so destabilizations, other concepts such as presence, identity, historical progress, epistemic certainty, university of meaning, right? All these concepts are rethought about, right? And deconstructed, reconstructed if necessary. Okay, so where modernity try to make things homogeneous, right? Postmodernity questions, destabilizes, right? And makes identifying, grouping, classification almost impossible. Okay, so where modernity had made progress into a linear system, postmodernity makes progress impossible because the world is non-linear. So there being no one end, so there is actually no end, right? There is only progress but no end. And even progress itself is being challenged because it's like it implies a linear kind of thinking, right? From point A to B, and B means that you have made progress compared to A, right? But actually it's not. It's just about questioning and making the best out of what we have. Right, so it's a plural view because it recognizes multiple viewpoints and reinstates them, right? And sees that the world is interconnected, but each country itself is different and unique, right? So this postmodern world is rhizomic, where everything is possible but not necessarily distinct, linear, or progressive. Okay, so everything in postmodernity has been derealized. And identity, constancy, substance, this kind of concept has been dissolved. Okay, so on the photograph on the right, after the demolition of the Pruitt Eagle, right, is tabula rasa. So what do we build now? How do we build now? So objects are seen as having a potential value rather than having an active value. Right, so values themselves are not fixed. They're not self-contained. So it leads to the arrival of a part of a kind of economy that is based on the system of future potentiality, right, and is independent of corporal being. Okay, so what it means is that I think in recent years maybe the equivalent would be like NFTs, right? So you can see the NFTs being a copy, right? It's a digital copy of, let's say, a work of art. That is one approach. Or NFTs themselves are seen as a kind of product, a kind of art in itself. So there was this debate, right? You see, a lot of people says that actually it has no value, so it can be replicated and so on and so forth. But the thing is potential, right? People are buying, spending millions of dollars buying into that NFT artwork, right? Because of the future potentiality, right? So not depending on how much it's worth at that point in time. So there's like a lot of speculation you've seen in the past few years, right? In the field of NFT lah. So that is like the that is like the system of future potentiality being pushed to quite far. Okay, so in the physical landscape itself, right, it also has no distinct boundaries or identity. So technology becomes a means, but the ends is no longer clear. So nobody believes in okay, this is very generally speaking, just to illustrate the concepts of postmodern. Nobody believes in a future that's technologically driven, perfect, right? Nobody believes in that anymore. People can be suspicious. In fact, people can envision technology as being the end of humanity, right? As you can see in the dystopian kind of fiction or cinema, right? Things like Terminator, things like Fallout, right? The recent series on Netflix, that is actually a reboot of the games in the, I think, in the early 2000s, right? So the technology, a world that's driven by technology is no longer utopian, right? No longer like perfect. It can be imperfect and dystopian also, right? So there are new possibilities. So this example, you see Michael Jackson and Bubbles, right, which is sculpture by Jeff Koons, right, in 1988. Right, so I think this is one example of the kind of work of art that emerged from the possibility of this kind of thinking, right? And as mentioned just now, we see it also in NFT art in the past couple of years. So there's no more united man, right? No united society or united whole. Okay, bodies in the postmodern worlds are non-body, no longer singular, but limitless continuities, right? So it's about bodies to bodies and the relationship between the bodies. And also, there's no clear distinction between the real physical world and the virtual world, right? Because of the possibilities that are brought forth by technology. So in this case, the Titanic, right? A piece of artwork by Stanley Tigerman, this is in 1978, is done by a photo montage on paper. Okay, so now I think now we can probably do it in like Photoshop and stuff, right? But in 1978, the ability to take a photograph of this masterpiece by Mies van der Rohe, right, which is the masterpiece of modernity, right, and then they develop it and then they cut it out and collage it onto the backdrop of a landscape photography, right, showing that it's sinking and linking it to the Titanic. So it's like modernity is like the Titanic. Once upon a time, it was thought to be unsinkable and then thought to be like the universal truth, right? But now it has sunk, right? And you recognize that actually the sky is so vast out there. The horizon is almost infinite, right? It's too big. The world is too big to be contained in this one small building, right? It was a mammoth, it was a masterpiece, but actually, in retrospect, now you look at it, it's actually a small piece that, almost like a vessel in the limitless ocean. So, and now it has sunk, right? So why are we limiting ourselves to this one little vessel when you have the whole ocean? Okay, so history as a subject has fallen apart. All there is discontinuity and chance. Okay, so postmodernity now is considered the end of history. Okay, in not in a non-linear sense, but in terms of ideology. So I think you can link it to it's kind of like uncharted waters, if you think about it, right? It's almost like we are looking at, let's say, the Renaissance, right, where because we have deconstructed a lot of the social and accepted norms, right, now there's a lot of thinking that humans have to think about, right? A lot of structures that they have to establish. Okay, so next we move on to the postmodernism as a kind of philosophy. In design, it responded to the kind of diversified, plural worldview. Okay, so what if both and or were equally valid? What if different approaches were needed for different contexts? What if history, technology, pop culture are all valid sources for design and could be used together? Okay, so on the right you see cover page for this book by Charles Jenks, The Language of Postmodern Architecture. Okay, so this is very different from the imagery of modernity that we are used to. So in design, it begins with Venturi's Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture. That was published in 1966. This is a important text, right? For postmodernism, right? And Robert Venturi, as we know by now, very important practitioner for postmodernism. So multiple modes of thoughts, views, and objects were all seen at once, right? And they were valid, right? So if you think about, can you all think about a art movement that is kind of similar? It's Cubism, right? Right. So rewind a bit now. So I think last year we talked about Cubism. So Cubism is also about multiple viewpoints, right? Because the artists now should no longer compete with realistic depiction, because now you have the technology of the camera serving that function, right? So the Cubist approach is recognizing that actually the experience of a human is multiple viewpoints, right? And then if you are limiting yourself to one shot, right, that is very limiting, right? And where different views, different thoughts, different objects come together, actually becomes something new. Okay, so there's a linkage to the Cubist thought. So back to architecture. Venturi and Scott Brown accepted a pluralistic worldview. So they themselves has a piece of work, a writing called Learning from Las Vegas, 1972. It argued that while Las Vegas was decorative, is quiche, it didn't make sense to the modernist eyes, right? But they argued that actually it's almost all right, right? So once upon a time, right, let's say like 20 years ago, they would say like, they would look at Las Vegas as like with disdain, like oh, it's so, I don't know whether it's too strong a word to use, but maybe like it's too corrupted, from our modernist ideals. Modernist is like the truth, and these people are doing all these weird things there, right? So in Learning from Las Vegas, actually Venturi and Scott Brown argued that actually Las Vegas is all right, right? Right, what's wrong with Las Vegas? It's okay. That's just it's just there. It's just grown based on what they need and what they want. So it's okay. It's actually fine. So design in Las Vegas made sense for Las Vegas, right? Why do you, let's say if you are in Europe and you look at Las Vegas, why do you have to take reference? Why do you have to judge, right? Las Vegas is what Las Vegas needs. Full stop. So there's no singular vision for all. Okay, so a non-city without buildings. Las Vegas was a decorated shed, right? So the things like the signboard, the image, the billboard, right? It was postmodernism. Okay, so these are some of the excerpts of the photographs and the diagrams inside. Okay, so imagine you're driving on a highway. That is also the vision of the modern life, right? Everybody owning an automobile. There's a highway. So if the highway is very different from, say, the European villages, the European cities that we have seen, right? It's also very different from, say, the Asian cities that we have seen, which is like we're traveling on foot. So if you're walking through the city itself, the experience is very different, right? So in this case, if you're driving, if this is the life that you're promoting, right? Everybody in an automobile, there should be a new kind of a new kind of component to this cityscape, which in this case is the sign. And it's not a small road sign, it's it's a huge sign, right? Because you're traveling at very high speed. It has to catch your attention. It has to tell whatever you want to tell in the shortest amount of time while not endangering your driving. Right? So the whole architecture is concepts of modernity is turned upside down. It's like, actually, I don't need a very nicely detailed building, right? Maybe a building in the shape of a duck, right? It's not wrong, right? It's necessary, because I need to because of the particular function to speak to the drivers on the highway. Okay, so it becomes like a decorated shed, and then there's a billboard imagery. So you can see actually the photograph on the left. You're driving on the highway, you see a big donut drive-in. So okay, that's when I can drive in and park and have my donut and I take a break, right? Or I can drive and do a drive-through. Okay, so the typology is very different already. So the big, in terms of visual emphasis, right, the sign has so much more emphasis in terms of form compared to the actual building itself. So the building itself becomes like a shed. It just serves its functional purpose. Okay, so the relationship between the signs and what it signifies, right? It changes because it's in Las Vegas and it's necessary there. Okay, so the building blends into whatever is closest to it, right? Responding to its context. So you can see here in the Sainsbury Wing, National Gallery in London, Venturi, Scott Browns and Associates, right, designed this, completed in 1991. So it takes reference to a rather classical kind of order and detail, right? But so it's recognizing history, and they recognize the aesthetics that is derived from order, proportion, right? But at the same time, you notice that it's not as rigid. It's no longer like a rectangle or a square, right? It adapts to the surrounding context. Okay, so the architects do not impose their ideas on others, right? But it takes what he or she needs, he or she thinks is good, right? And it responds and it adapts to the site, to the program. The complexity which arises from the context, right, where the building is situated, right, actually involves a lot on how the building is designed. Okay, so the site speaks for itself. And one architect, one building can belong to many groups at the same time, right? Because the possibility is opened, and to experiment is seen in a positive light, right? In fact, it's very encouraging. It's very encouraged at this point in time, right? It's not frowned upon to do something new and to test something new. Okay, so this pluralism explains why so many ideas, design concepts, and traditions are valid. And rewind this quote by Venturi: "Less is more," right? Which Venturi used to sum up his postmodernist philosophy and approach. So it also marks the end of a unified styles of design. From the late 20th century, there are only themes and directions. So every time you get to design something, it's a new potential. It's like a tabula rasa that I can test something new, right? Whereas, if you consider it designing during modernism, you'll be like, okay, there's a system that I use to set things out, then I do things in a certain way. Okay, so now under postmodernism, it's just free. There's an air of freedom. I can test, I can just try and experiment, and it's seen in a positive light. I'm no longer limited by the chains of modernity. So design cannot be organized into groups with unified ideas, right? But different things occurred simultaneously. Okay, so this Charles Zhang's evolutionary tree of architecture that he attempted to visualize in 2000. Okay, so you can see that actually is not, if you're going to do this tree in a modernist way, it's quite impossible, right? But under postmodernism, you can see that, okay, actually it's recognizing that relationships are not linear, right? It is organic, right? And time in this context still flows in a linear way, but at least the relationship between the styles, right? If you do a mapping, it's very organic and it's very dynamic. Okay, so postmodernism also dismissed ideas that function was the most important, right? And the cheap and bad quality is elevated to design. So postmodernism can be purely decorative, right? They attempted to glorify the common, attempted to have fun, and to celebrate pop culture. Okay, so it's like I can take furniture design can inspire the artist can inspire furniture design, and including the other design disciplines as well. So in the spirit of fun, of experiment to create something new. So plastic, laminate, hiding substrates is fine, right? Design is to be photographed, to be an image, and it's not to be truthful, right? So to be superficial is also fine in this context, right? Whereas traditionally, I think if you deal with architecture, we'll be very concerned with how things come together, right? So if you look at the works by the Memphis Group, the image on the bottom right corner, right? So this is a very classic piece of furniture, Yeah, it's like an artifact of civilization, in my opinion. Yeah, but if you look at it, right, then you compare it to, say, a Japanese temple or a Chinese temple, right? Remember, they were so concerned about how the timber pieces come together and how the grain of the timber is allowed to stand out. Right? So in this case, when they design this, you can see the approach is totally different. Like actually the surface, I can be plywood, the structure can be plywood and I laminate it, or it can be entirely PVC. It's okay, right? And I don't even need to show how I join it, right? I can join, I can hide it. Yeah, so being truthful in the construction, expressing the construction actually is not not of paramount importance, right? If you are a designer who wants to search for the truth, yes, go ahead. But I can have fun, and the truthfulness in construction can take a back seat, and that's okay. Okay, so decoration and surface become structure, and ornament is something that's fun and engaging. It's no longer something that's like almost like a sin, right? As we are used to under modernity. So how to design is irrelevant, and there are no rules. Okay, historicism returns as a source of the formal language of design, but now with basically because design, there are no more rules, right? So anybody can do it, depending. Okay, anybody can respond to history in his or her own way, right? So in this case, Charles Moore, he digs into the pocket of history, right? He takes out these elements and then he has some fun with them, right? And cast neon lights. It's up to the designer, so it's okay as long as the client is willing to pay and then they are happy with this. It's okay. That's how things are. So history now becomes a buffet, So it's a buffet with new forms of various times and places for people to take, collage them, right? If you like the very traditional order, you want to recreate it, yes, by all means, go ahead. If you want to do something like Charles Moore has done, take the pieces and throw it like a kid playing around with pieces of Lego, right? And then you add a layer of neon lighting. That's fine as well. So postmodernism collapsed history, making it a continually shifting, interrelated web. Okay, it also appropriates stylistic languages from other places and recontextualize them. Okay, so there is a very strong relation to the context, right? More so, at least in the case of Charles Moore, the response to the context, the response to the needs of the users, the program of the space, right, there was more emphasis on that compared to the stylistic languages, the accuracy of the stylistic language from the past. Okay, so the Roman ruin, in this case, they can be recreated for fun, to throw sarcasm, right? And it's not supposed to be taken like very seriously in this case. Okay, so now they are also free to make fun of itself, right? So imagine if you are an architect under modernity, right? Which of them would poke fun at themselves, right? Almost quite impossible to imagine, right? But poking fun becomes possible, and I think it's quite an important characteristics, right? This freedom that postmodernity allows. Okay, so pop culture plus historical models, right, gives ideas of the seven dwarfs as architectural order, right? So the Team Disney building in California by Michael Graves in 1986. Okay, so you need not remember when we were looking at, say, I think the closest example is probably the Tanjong Pagar railway station, right, where you still have that four figures propping up the building, the roof of the building, right? So and they embody virtuals, right? Certain orders, once upon a time, things like honesty, courage, or if it's a building that's usually, say, associated with agriculture and harvesting, maybe you'll recognize the weather and stuff like that, right? But once upon a time, that was it, But pop culture, because of the freedom, it allows you to say, okay, now instead of opting for this kind of very heavy, very serious kind of statue, right? I'll just say, because I'm designing a building for Disney, right? So in the world that within the gates of this the Wonderland, right? Actually, who is most important? Having fun is more important, right? So, and the seven dwarfs being such pivotal characters in the Disney canon, right? They are so important for Disney. So I'll use them instead of, say, a structure or a sculpture that says things like truth, loyalty, So in this case, Michael Graves opted for the seven dwarfs. So the ornament grows comically large and threatens to overwhelm the building. So that itself is also an element of fun, right? So we don't know, that Michael Graves did it intentionally or is commercial decision by Disney. And in this case, Michael Graves, in his response, he threatens to overwhelm it as a fun, right, against the control or the lack of control as well. So anything is possible, basically. So historical order is disordered for the postmodern world. Any reference can be reinterpreted. It can be subverted. Historical forms becomes a model for new postmodern compositions. Right, appropriation, collage, and montage are valid techniques for design. Right, so in the 1990, Michael Graves designed Swan and Dolphin Resort. You can see here. So the first thing that's legible, is the swans and the clams, right? Then you are on a closer look, you look at the facade of the building with its colorful patterns and motifs, right? So once again, it's that the fun, the element of fun, the element of legibility and the signs, right? When you look at the building, the first thing you're looking at are those exaggerated signs. So by the 1980s, modernism is now kind of like dead, right? I wouldn't say that there is a period, there's a definite time that is dead, right? But it's just kind of fell out of favor by the 1980s, right? It becomes a stylistic and formal reference, like I can design in a modernist style, then I would just, it's supposed to look like something, right? But it doesn't have this, doesn't have its soul anymore, just have the body, but you don't know soul. So this AT&T Tower, 1984 by Philip Johnson. So it has classical reference at the base. It's modernist in the center and postmodern at the top. Okay, so it's a mix and match. So is this a work of postmodernism? Right, probably so. You take now, now modernity also becomes like just one component in the bag of tricks already. So what if the client comes to you and say, I still prefer a modern building, but I still prefer a modern building that looks kind of serious, but now in its current context, if you were to design such a building, it would be very passé and people wouldn't like it. So how do we approach it? So as an architect, this is one of the possible response to the issue, You take the position of the postmodernist, right, and recognize modernity as one of the components in your bag of tricks, in your library to reference, right, and then you take it and then you reinterpret it, have some fun with it, right, so you have the best of both worlds. So by the 1990s, postmodernism itself becomes a style and starts to reinvent, starts to use itself as a reference. Okay, so this 1998 library building by Herzog de Meuron, one of their not really early but one of the most important earlier works. Yep. So postmodernism by 1990s, it becomes another historical style to be appropriated, right? So the building itself becomes an image, a picture of pictures, and it can be a self-referential postmodern image over a modern form. So you can see, okay, Herzog de Meuron, at that point in time, famous for minimalist work, right? Simple forms, amazing details, right? And certain a very classy kind of outlook, very modern outlook. In fact, you can see that actually the lines, the edge of the building is kind of even parallel with the cables. But anyway, in this case, how they do it is that in terms of the formal language, right, it's like a mix of minimalism with a certain reference to classical order, right, in terms of the proportions, but at its essence, it's kind of minimalist, right, which is consistent with their preceding works, right. But the postmodern comes in by the paneling system they use for the building facade. And in this case, right, you notice that, okay, it's strange, right? It's like a series of imagery. So it's imprinted imagery on concrete panels. It's imprinted imagery on glass. Okay, so by that, right, actually Herzog de Meuron makes the most out of the technology that's possible at a point in time once again, right? And it plays with that technology for the facade composition. So it's like a minimalist building becomes much more complex, right, by this detail, right? And the quality of the interior spaces and the quality of how the building looks during day and night, right? There's actually many layers of build meaning and reading that you can go through, and it becomes such a rich architecture, right? As compared to, say, it's just a plain minimalist building, right? So many layers of possibilities that's overlaid, right? Because of the reinvention, using postmodernist approach. Okay, so modern language can still be used, but we are no longer modern. So the early 21st century remains postmodern, right? Still the lack of absolute truth, no clear rules of design, lack of meaning, and there's lack of right or wrong way to design. Okay, so there are many different ways of approach, looking, and it's okay. Postmodernism know that it's fake. It's fake, and it's okay. Doesn't mean that it's fake, it's bad. No, it's fake. But if people like it, it's okay. That's the kind of approach. And the images on the right, you see the examples of some of the imprints, right, that's been applied on the building facade materials. Right, so you have a mix of beautiful detailing, right, combined with the postmodernist applications, satire, right, coexisting. Okay, plural, postmodernisms. So as it acknowledges destabilization and unraveling of the direct linear thoughts and fixed meanings, right, it became aware of the act of making architecture and how and the artifice surrounding it. Okay, so architecture itself is recognized as artifice and falsehood. So this design looking at itself, designing, right? It is undesigning of design. Okay, so this is by Site Architects in 1974. They did a series of showrooms, which are very fun and very interesting, right? In the response to in the way they poke fun on the practice of architecture. Okay, so this is the best products showroom. Yeah, you can check out the other works as well, and the philosophy behind Site Architects. So the modernist white cube, right, is now smashed apart, and the cube is crumbling and broken, right? So it's not crumbling and broken due to age, It's crumbling and broken based on intent, right? So if you're traveling along the highway, at a certain point in time, actually the building looks like a complete modernist shape. Yeah, it's a rectangle, nicely detailed, and as you walk along, right, it starts to fall apart. Okay, so modernism no longer stable, now it's disintegrating. Okay, so that is, you might argue, it's a very superficial, quite a superficial approach to that, right? But nobody says it's wrong. It's not wrong. It's fine. It's just one of the approach. As long as someone likes it, as long as the client likes it, it's okay, right? And then the architect has their fun in the postmodernist way as well. So one of the branches, it branched into several different ways, right? One of them is high tech, right? So in this case, Santa Pobido by Richard Rogers, Rental Piano, right, in 1977. Yeah, actually when I see the year, every time I see the year, it's still as fascinating as before, right? Imagine this building was done designed and built in the 1970s, right? So the facade is now removed, right, and the inner workings of the building are exposed. In this case, the building is flipped inside out, right? So services on the outside, spaces on the inside. Right, the building facade is made out of staircases, plumbing, sanitary, ACMB, right? So the services become parts of the facade treatment. So design now is a way of thought, a way of developing ideas, of critique and discussion, right? Which we are probably more familiar with, right? This might be more familiar to us, right? Because we are kind of used to this, right? Whereas the 13 sessions that we covered, right, I think a lot of them will be like, feels kind of alien. It's like once upon a time, right? So deconstruction, an important branch of postmodernism as well. So this is Jacques Derrida. He is a philosopher, right? So his writings are very important because they are used for architecture as well, right? To drive architectural design and under deconstruction. So while Pompidou and the best stores by site architects are deconstructed, they are not deconstruction. So deconstruction begins as a critical mode of analyzing design through practice. Right? So it's more about theory rather than style. So deconstruction comes from literary theory and asserts that all meaning are unstable because they depend on meanings that are not fixed. Okay, so this is a bit fluffy because it's philosophy, right? But it's quite fun if you all are interested to look into it. So Jacques Derrida's work from the late 1960s onwards can be considered the origins of the deconstructivist kind of theory. Okay, so concepts from semiotics and language entered architectural theory in the 1980s. All right, so there are certain parallels because if you think about architecture, it's actually a form of language itself, right? When you design a house, it's the same as, say, a composer putting together a piece of musical work. A symphony, is it a symphony or a chamber piece? So it's very different. Or is it a series of poems? Yeah, so it is a language in itself. So the design of architecture separates from the practice of architecture, right? So architectural practice, I think you all will encounter it next year. Yeah. So you notice that actually the practice, how architecture is practiced, how a building is built, how we manage it, is different from the design bit, right? In the under the construction. So design can be autonomous, a set of formal ideas, geometries, technologies, and independent of function, use, and economy. Okay, so you can design for design's sake. Okay, that is also liberating. For example, the works of Archigram, right? How many of them are actually built? Very little, I would say, but they are very pivotal. They exist in a separate space, and becomes a artifact of history as well. And in fact, yeah. So I mean that is just to illustrate the difference between the two. And fractals, in this sense, becomes a way of introducing complexity and depth across varying scales. Right. So Peter Estermans in the 1970s, right, did a series of case study houses. Right. So you need not build the house. You need not have a client to build the house. Right. You can either examine it in your own time, all right, or maybe you are part of a university or a kind of academic institution that supports your work in the study of design. The design of architecture in itself becomes a sub-discipline. So the linguistic sign has no fixed meaning, and nothing is absolute, and there's no fixed truth and only chains of reference. So once again, revisiting learning from Las Vegas, right, where we learned about the science and the signifier and the science. Deconstructions offer the potential to deconstruct the text of design, to excavate the chain of reference of the signs and symbols and words that make up the language of design, right? So, for example, now, if you think of let's say, you think of a house, it's like, okay, floor, wall, ceiling, roof, windows, doors, right? So all these are like, if you are writing a story, right, it's like these can be certain vocabularies, verbs, adjectives, right? And how do you piece them together into something that a writing, right, based on the story you want to tell. Okay, so that's a very simplistic way of trying to illustrate that in a physical sense, right? But it's I love it lah. So anyway, if you're interested, you can go deeper and find out. It's very exciting. So we make chains of reference for our form making, and symbolism in architecture is the result of a chain of meaning. So it's references, referring to references, referring to references, and so on. Right, so the link, the line, right, can stretch on forever to infinity. So to deconstruct is to understand the chain of reference, which is to understand its meaning, right? So if architecture becomes an image of a chain of reference. So this image by a collage by Rem Koolhaas, 1972, right, the Exodus, or the Voluntary Prisoners of Architecture. Okay, so this method of collage, right, made possible by technology, and also because of Rem Koolhaas' background as a script writer. right? So it's almost like a cinematic space, right? Which is why it was so revolutionary at that point in time. Okay, so if you think about deconstruction, right, in order to really understand something, you really got to deconstruct it. If not, you don't really understand it completely, right? At most, you're looking at it from the surface, right? But if you want to really understand something, it can be anything actually. Since it's philosophy, right, it's not just architecture, right? A piece of design, or maybe your favorite storybook, right? Or it can be relationships, right? You really have to deconstruct it and take it apart, right? Examine the parts and piece it together, and you have more. And when you piece it together, it might become something else, right? Because now you know the difference between the glue that holds them together. Okay, so yeah, but just be careful because it might deconstruct the entire worldview and stuff like that, right? Which requires a certain level of maturity. So very interesting if you guys want to consider it. Right, so the chain of reference for the Venturi House, Philadelphia, 1964, Robert Venturi. So I think last year, if you recall, we probably would have spoken about this house because it's a masterpiece of postmodernist thought. Right, so you can see apart from the geometrical games, right, there is a lot of reference to classical forms, shapes, proportions, right, and recreated and overlaid on before he plays with his geometrical games, right? So once again, you analyze it on the first level. You can look at geometry, and if you go deeper, right, you can look into the details. And if you understand history, right, if you understand the orders, say in Roman, Greco-Roman architecture, then you will know that, oh, he's trying to do that here, right? So on and so forth. Okay, so that itself is an important part of history. To know history, you must know something before you deconstruct. And deconstruct requires a complete, very comprehensive understanding in the first place, right? And after you deconstruct, you have an even deeper view on it. Okay, so Derrida's theory about representation, how a representation constructs a view of reality and becomes perceived as the image of truth. So deconstruction itself is a self-reflecting analytical tool to help us see past our constructed representations and to understand how these shape our own view of the world and how our meanings are constructed and shaped. So architecture becomes a process. Okay, so this image you see is very famous artwork by Zaha Hadid in 1982. So the Peak, Hong Kong. Okay, so you can see that, okay, in terms of, it's an artwork, right? It functions as an artwork, right? But by an architect. So it's not like a photograph with a realistic render of the design for the peak. Actually, it's not, right? It's abstract, right? It contains the artist or the architect's view or the forces, the landscape, how it's moving, right? And how the architecture, the planes, right, all come together in a composition. Okay, so architecture itself becomes a process. So this is Parc de la Villette. So this is by Paris, Bernard Schumi, 1987. So Bernard Schumi was very influenced by the writings of Derrida, right? And he attempts to adapt his writing to design. Okay, so this is the image that you see. The Parc de la Villette is design competition, right, for the city of Paris, right? So it's looking at Paris as a park, an urban park. Okay, so in this case, right, instead of designing a park itself, Schumi looks at the grid of the park. He creates a grid which he expands and superimpose it onto the park. So it's no longer just a park itself, it's no longer just, say, a building itself, but it's a series of points on the grid, right? And each of these points create a specific spatial relationship to the ground around it. So they become, right, in physical form, in build form, a pavilion, right? Each of them very unique, and they are unified by the general rate that's being used. So it relates to its immediate context, right? So the meanings, qualities can change depending on the surrounding context. And this grid can be expanded infinitely. Right, so the border, you notice that actually there's no border. There's no more border, right? You can expand the grid, another grid in the same order beyond the boundary, and you're no longer, the border is no longer an important visual element in his site layout. But at the same time, based on how he draws it, you know where the boundary is lah. Alright, so that is like visual. I think last year probably I would have talked about visual emphasis and contrast, right? So this is a way that you can play with it. So nothing is experienced as a whole, but as fragments, right? So each form is decontextualized, non-absolute, and can be altered. So here you can see this is one of the nodes, right? One of the points of the grid. So at this point, right, you look at this. Okay, this is how it responds, and if you walk along the pathway, you come to the next one. The next one will look different, right? Because it responds differently to the surrounding context. So imagine the amount of possibilities that it allows the designers to think of. It's actually very exciting. So there's external references construct the bodies of architecture, right? So meaning is no longer definite. It can be constructed, it can be altered, it can be added, it can be subtracted, so on and so forth, right? So it's very liberating for architecture. Okay, deconstructivism. So after the 1988 MoMA show, curated by Philip Johnson and Mark Wigley, deconstruction became deconstructivism, right? So once again, the landmark in history, 1988 MoMA show. So it's something like, let's say, the Crystal Palace, 1921, right? Yeah. So that if you're looking at history, there are always like these important landmarks that mark the shift to something. Of course, it's very generalization. We are generalizing things, but in order to make things legible, you need to do that. So in attempting to explain deconstruction, the complexity of the idea was reduced to a style. So upon becoming a style, deconstructivism itself suffered the same problems as postmodernist historicism, becoming self-referential form-making without the content. Okay, so this is a Federation Square by Lab Architecture Studio, between 1997 to 2002, 5 years of design construction. So quite interesting use of fractal geometry, and very fascinating how they derive the geometry. Okay, so if you look at it, okay, it looks very haphazard, right? Like anyhow. But you notice that actually, if you look at the parts, it's made up of triangles, right? And the triangle is a right angle. It's a right angle triangle, actually. It's not like those random triangles. And how they mix and match and how they derive this geometry, right, has a certain reference to astrology. Quite fascinating, the design of the facade. Yeah, and the designers are actually, their approach, right, is very logical and very systematic. Yeah, which might be a bit surprising when you're looking at such a form. Yeah, but I guess in today's context, if you look at this form, it's not as surprising as 20 years ago. Yeah, when it first came out, it was like, wow, it's something really quite amazing. Okay, so deconstructivism became an empty shell, a visual design style with little to do with the literary deconstruction from which it emerged, right? So it's more of form over substance, right? A lot of the substance, the energy and the robustness of Derrida's text, right, are lost, right? So if it's not surprising if a designer does it in a deconstructivist way, he or she has no knowledge of the underlying philosophy of Derrida, Jacques Derrida, right? That's not surprising in today's context. So the stylistic expression of deconstructivism is a manifestation of nothing other than its own stylistic expression, Okay, so here is a famous Heydar Aliyev Cultural Center in Baku by Zaha Hadid 2012. Quite, yeah, very beautiful, and also very complex building if you look at it. I mean, at first glance, you look at it, it's very simple, right? It's very simple. But once again, if you study it, you can unearth multiple layers of meanings. Okay, so postmodernism. So in recent years, actually, or rather our time, right, postmodernism has also been questioned. So if postmodernism was a questioning of modernism, right, and postmodernism was there for like how many years really? At least 50 years, 50, 60 years, right? Now is about time, right, that we go and take postmodernism apart. So new discussion questions both modernism and postmodernism, right? So you're critiquing the critique of a piece of history. So it's like referencing the reference of a reference already, right? So we are now perhaps looking in the postmodernist age, right? A meta-modernism. Okay, so anyway, this is like academic questioning. So as a critique and culmination of the past, meta-modernism offers much more possibilities, right? So if you're going to link it to, okay, once again, this is too simplified, but if modernism, you can link it to the age of radio, and then television came about, so modernisms. So the concept of meta-modernisms, right, is linked to the age of internet, right? So in today's context, right, I think for your generation, if you look at internet, it's something that's is normal already, or is something even of the past already. You can barely imagine a world where there was no internet. Yeah, but for our time, actually, we can see the difference between radio. Okay, my time was I can see from television becoming internet, from television to internet, right? But for my siblings, my elder siblings, they can see radio to television and television to internet. Yeah, so quite interesting. Yep, so 11 meta-modern methods in the arts, right? So Big Bang, this is by OUL Studio 2017, conceptual project for NYC. So this is 7 years ago lah. So is render with collage with actual photograph, right? So now we have AI, right? So where machine learning, so things become more and more realistic. Like I can even come up with a beautiful render that's almost lifelike, right? I can now design a building and smack it right in the middle of Central Park, right? And it looks as though I really went to take a photograph of it. Okay, so there are, I think this one you can read it in your own time, but it's quite interesting, the meta-modern methods in the arts, and to consider now because of the various kind of medium we have compared to what we had under postmodern, right? Meta-modern, now we have things like the cinema, right? So the cinematic space itself, you look at it, is quite an interesting, to me, it's an interesting branch of architecture as well, because it's really space making and it's an enclosed space, right? And the stories you can tell through the cinematic space, the experience is very different, right, from the architectural experience of the building itself. Okay, so we should not go there because it's too much to think about. I spent many years thinking about the cinematic space and physical architecture and becoming confused along the way, so I shall not confuse you all. But it was a fruitful trip at the end, I would say. Yeah, so anyway, you all can examine in your own time. So, okay, postmodernism. So yet even this questioning has a historical basis, right? So this group of observers of architecture suggested that back in the 1980s that design needed to be within context, right? So there's a term that they coined called, critical regionalism. Oh yes, it's written here. So for Canon Frampton, the context was cited and regional was critical. So it was a critical regionalism which took part in a universal civilization with elements that indirectly is particular to a place. Alright, so dismissing pluralism and historicism for their reduction of context, critical regionalisms attempted to understand both local and global without reducing the context to a sign. Alright, so once again, it's a different kind of approach. You can, in terms of physical manifestation, this critical regionalism, right? I think closer to us, maybe you can see it in the works of Tadao Ando, right? Tadao Ando is you notice that his works, right, is okay. You can say that okay, it's a modernist example, purity of form, use of materials, but there is also a recognizing and elevation of the Japanese traditional aesthetics, right? So, and then you rewind a couple of decades, right? You have Alvaro Aalto, right? So you can see that in his designs, he is experimenting under modernity, right? But there's something that's so Finnish, is something that's so North European in his design. Okay, so that is what Canon Frampton means by the term critical regionalism. So we are perhaps already in a new age. Don't need to say perhaps that we are already in a new age. We're always in a new age, because if you think about the present, you have one step in the second that's passed and one step in the second that's coming. So we are always stepping into the new age with a new way of marking design and engaging with the world around us, both local and global, both individual and collective. So we combine past, present, future, pressing needs, and our human desire for meaning, human desire for beauty, right? So this is innate, searching for something that's beautiful. Like if you throw a mess on the table, right? Naturally you want to, if you're idling, if you're bored, I think naturally we want to, you're going to piece them together, shift them around, and then question things like that. And I think during adolescence, right, one of the questions you would have thought about, right, would be like, oh, what's the meaning of life? What's the meaning of doing all this? What is the meaning of that? So that itself, right, is like deeply human. Yeah, and it's something to be thankful for, this desire for meaning, actually. And then you can have all sorts of thoughts and definition. And in fact, that search for meaning is something that's in itself very meaningful to undertake. Yeah. So concerns about sustainability, those are immediate needs, right? Climate instability, geopolitical crises, pandemics, ethnical and social concerns will shape our architecture in new ways. Yeah, it's very interesting because, like, for example, when I did houses in like Myanmar, right, just like say 5 years ago versus for 5 years after is a big difference, because 5 years ago it was like a new dawn, right, for the country, right? So the aspirations for architecture back then was very different. It was towards a progressive, showing that now they have these newfound capabilities and they want to shape this way into a new future. And overnight, there was the military coup, right, which flipped things around, So, and overnight, the way of thinking about houses, right, is flipped upside down. Now you have to think about things like security and preserving the basic needs, and while recognizing and preserving beauty for our next generation. So, and things are accelerating, changes are accelerating in a very faster and faster, right? So the age of the architectural icon and the star architect perhaps is over. Yeah, star architect was like a few decades, 1 or 2 decades ago, right? It was so, I think especially when the Middle East was started building, right, and China started building, right, there was this period for the star architect, right, like we engaged this star power, design this magnificent icon, like which I think Frank Gehry was one of the pioneers of the star architect, right. This was in 2000s, right. This kind of form that became associated with the designer, right? And then they're engaged to kind of recreate or to dream up a new spectacle, right? Yeah, so I think with that, it's like, it feels more like an introduction than a conclusion, right? Because I think what we have done in this very short module, right, itself is to really give you guys, the class itself, right, a perspective on history, right, of what has taken place before and what the civilization, how they've thought about life, how civilization has progressed, right, in spite of all the circumstances and the shifts in philosophy and so on and so forth, right? So I think at the start of the module, right, I think we ask as some participation question, I think in the forum or so, probably some in the worksheet as well, to define history, like think about history. What does it mean? What's the value of history, right? So I think as a student, like if you think, I mean, when I was a student, when I hear about the word history, it's like, oh, super boring, so dry, yeah. So I think at this age, there is the maturity for you guys to really start to understand the value of history and the value of going back in time and learning about how people have done certain things, right? So, and being mature enough to really find out what works for you, what doesn't work for you, all right? And also, it becomes a very useful material for you to mix in your own thinking process as part of the material and your own design process, right? So, yeah, hopefully at the end of the day, this module proved helpful for you all, right? And my concern is not so much about the accuracy of, it's not about how much historical facts you all can memorize. It's not about I memorized like, oh, this building was designed in what style in what year, right? Actually, that is kind of secondary, especially in our time where we have AI helping us remember so many things, right? So creating the library. What is more important, I hope that you guys get, right, is the way of looking, right? Looking back into history and recognizing there's so much information there, right? So it's almost like opening a box of Lego, and then finding the pieces that works for you, right? And then if you are interested enough, right, you can go deeper and find many layers of meaning within that itself, right? Because that is talking in a practical sense. That is actually one of the branches that in the architectural profession, that is one of the branch. There are work that's related to conservation, where you have to unearth meanings, right, and apply them in the real world, right? Or you can there's work in a museum, right, where your work is about research and educating the public on these layers of meaning. There's work on being an academic, just researching on this kind of histories and theories and so on and so forth. So many things that it can be done, not just in a theoretical sense, but in a bread and butter sense as well, right? So hopefully you guys found something useful for this module. So with that, I think I will conclude this module itself. So thanks for the work, also the effort put in for the participation in the case studies and assignments, right? So very good work. So thank you all for that. Okay, so now go and have your well-deserved break and enjoy your holidays before coming back, recharge for the next semester. Okay, see you and have a nice day.